Professor Emeritus from the University of Missouri is going to bring us home.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I've been up in this area several times, and I've got to see some people that I've known from this area, and I'm glad to be back up here. And I just wish it was under better circumstances, because this is one of the things that I've done over the years is work with people in communities like you, and it's never a pleasant thing. What I attempted to do today, I put together a paper, which will be available, Mary will have that, what I call the facts and fallacies about CAFOs. And in that paper, there's a lot of different references that you've heard referred to here today. Some of those are in there and many others as well. So I want you to have kind of what I see as the facts, the things, the research, or some of the research that's been done. And I've relied heavily on what's called meta-studies, where you have massive studies that reference a lot of other different studies. And so that will be available there. But I want to say in the beginning that what I give you is my interpretation of the truth. You know, there's no agreement today on what's fact and what's fallacy. And so I have to say up front that what I give you is my truth. It's the facts as I see them. And I think one of the important things for you to realize in the situation that you're in here today is that there is no general agreement. And I would argue there is no objectivity. Because anybody who tells you that they have not made up their mind, that don't have a particular position when it comes to factory farms or CAFOs, simply is not telling you the full truth, or they don't understand enough about this issue to have taken a position upon it. So I think there is no middle ground. Now, many of you, I know none of you were really hoping for a fight whenever this proposal come into your community. Nobody likes to be involved in a conflict. And I think there's probably still people here in this community that are still hoping that you can find some middle ground that's going to make everyone happy. But I simply don't think that there is middle ground here. And I say that from experience. I say that from years that working with people in communities such as yours, and I have never worked in a community where there wasn't agreement on just one thing between the opponents and proponents of CAFOs. And the agreement is that whenever a controversy arises, it will rip the social fabric of that community apart. If this CAFO comes here, I can almost guarantee you that there will be people that have been friends for years that will no longer be friends. And there will be families where family members will hardly speak to each other again. And there will be church congregations that will be torn apart. And you've seen part of that already in this community bubbling up. But if it continues on and this CAFO locates here, this community will forever be transformed. And one of the things that makes your situation even worse than in most cases is that you're involved in not just the battle in your community, you're involved in the middle of what I call it an epic battle that is taking place all across the country, and it's a battle between growing public concern about industrialization of agriculture in general, of which CAFOs are the epitome, growing public concerns and the defense of that failed industry, my truth, by the agricultural establishment. And CAFOs being the epitome of industrial agriculture is the key battleground on which that is being fought. The arguments are like this, that the agricultural establishment will argue that modern, what they call modern industrial agriculture, specialized, standardized, consolidated, bigger and bigger, that kind of agriculture is absolutely essential for domestic food security and to feed the world. And on the other side, some of the concerns you've heard here today, that there's growing concerns among the general public about food safety, antibiotic resistance, the environmental, the social, the ecological, a whole range of concerns that are associated with that industrial food system, and that concern is continuing to grow. And there's an increasing number of people that are saying whatever benefits there are from the economic efficiency of industrial agriculture don't outweigh the ecological, the social, and the economic costs that we're seeing here today. In response to this growing public concern, because there's a lot of people that are still on the fence, but the concern is growing. In response to that, there's a massive public relations campaign that's been mounted by the agricultural establishment. You heard part of that here on the agricultural groups. If you want to check it out, and the references there, you can go to the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance. It's an organization that has like $500 million each from Monsanto and DuPont that's helping to fund it, along with the Cattlemen's Association and various other producers' association. And if you go to what they're talking about, and they clearly state that the intent of this massive PR campaign is to reestablish the confidence and trust among the general public in today's agriculture. And they're very good at what they do. They've hired some of the best PR firms in the country to put together the program. And they talk about the faces of farmers and ranchers, and you'll see the farmers and ranchers that they have on there telling their stories. And these are these young, articulate, very, very impressive faces of people that will come on and say, we're just family farmers, we take care of the land, we care about our neighbors, and we don't understand why we're being criticized. So that's what's going on. It's this big battle across the country. And if they focus on, and you all have gotten some publicity here, as I call it in my paper, if this becomes the Battle of Bayfield, then you can bet that there's going to be thousands, if not millions of dollars that are going to be focused on that public relations campaign to try to convince the people of the community that this is modern agriculture and you have to accept it here because this is what's happening and this is the future. This group spent $1.5 million in the state of Missouri to pass what was called the so-called right to farm law, which is basically a right to food, which put in the Missouri Constitution that they can do basically whatever they want to. Now you've got a moratorium, which I think is great. That gives you some time to organize, that gives you some time to know what's going on. But that's also time which I think you can expect if this is picked as one of the battlegrounds. They don't want to lose any battles. If this is picked as one of the battlegrounds, you can get ready for a massive public relations campaign here, and the people that are on the study group that you've talked about are going to be under tremendous pressure and probably offered a lot of perks and a lot of other things. So I'm just telling you that if this becomes part of that battleground, which I think is likely, I don't know that for sure, then you need to be ready for what's coming in the future. In the paper, I talk about some of the areas that they focus on in their public relations campaign, just to give you a taste of where they're coming from and what I see as the facts that refute the claims of the fallacies that they're putting out here. I talk about the areas of water pollution, animal welfare, food safety, and what they call prices and choices, kind of the necessity in order to keep food prices at reasonable levels to have this kind of operation. And I would say in every one of those areas, there's strong scientific evidence to support the indictment of industrial agriculture on every count. Kev talked about the Pew Commission report, and that's one of those meta-studies that I talked about. It's a 2.5-year study group that come together and reviewed all the literature on it. The group included the former governor and the former secretary of agriculture. And they concluded, and the reference, the exact quote is in the paper, but their conclusion was very clear. It said that large-scale concentrated animal feeding operations, what they called industrial animal agriculture production, presented unacceptable risk with respect to public health, the environment, the welfare of the animals. And they went on to conclude, they said the negative impacts are simply too great and the scientific information is too strong to be denied. They said that fundamental change was absolutely essential. As Keeve talked about, when they come back 5 years later, the conclusion was the absolutely essential changes had simply not been made. Now that we have the growing science which supports the indictments, if you check out the PR campaign again, they will say that science information no longer changes public opinion. They come to a new conclusion. They used to call for sound science. Every time you said anything, they'd say, get the sound science. Well, the science was being done by the people that supported them, mainly in the big agricultural universities that I spent many years at, as I'll talk before. But now that the tide of science has shifted against them, they say what we have to do now is we have to focus on public perceptions and emotions in the faces of farmers and ranchers. The campaign is clearly meant to label anybody who opposes these operations as being emotional, radical, environmentalists, tree huggers, animal rightists, a whole range of things. But I found in the years that I've worked with people that some of the best educated, best informed, most concerned people I've worked with have been people that have been organizing and pulling together information to oppose these large-scale animal feeding operations. They call it NIMBYs. They say it's not in my backyard, people. You know, if we don't take care of our own backyard, then who's going to do it? Concerned about our own backyard doesn't mean that we aren't concerned about other people's backyards and that we aren't willing to help them. And as far as emotion is concerned, you know that there are some people that are opposed to these operations that are emotional. But what if your kid was sick because of it? I've talked to people, you know, where their children have come down ill, that they were perfectly okay till they started spreading manure next to their bedroom window, and the little girl couldn't concentrate in school, and the little boy was getting head or infections and began bleeding out of the ears. Would you be emotional if that happened to your child? I don't think there's anything wrong with getting emotional whenever something is threatening the health of your family and destroying your quality of life. The people that I meet out here aren't the radical environmentalists or whatever. Most people are basically middle-class people that were out in the community, and many of them are farmers, and many of them, this is the first time they've ever been involved in any sort of political action at all, and they're offended by what's happening in their community, and they rise up in righteous indignations, and I don't blame them. They say, well, the people that are opposed to them are a bunch of vegetarians and vegans. That's not what they're concerned about. There's only 5% of the people in this country that are vegetarian, and about half of those are vegans. Both of them are growing very quickly, and that's what they're concerned about. They're concerned about the growth because of rising public concerns about what's happening in their operations. But it's not the vegans and the vegetarians. They're concerned about the rising public concern and the reflection that vegans and vegetarians may be a reflection of what's happening in the larger public perception of what's going on in industrial agriculture. I'm not a vegan, I'm not a vegetarian. In fact, I'm a longtime advocate of animal agriculture. Just to give you a little background on it, you know, I grew up on a small dairy farm down in southwest Missouri. I was fortunate enough to be able to go to the University of Missouri, and after I graduated my BS degree, I went to work with Wilson Meat Packing Company, the 4th largest meat packer in the country at that time. Also worked with the Kansas City stockyards for a while. I came back to the University of Missouri and got my PhD, and after that I worked for 30 years in 4 large agricultural universities. I was an agricultural economist. I'm not opposed to making money, you know, that's what I had my degree in, is agricultural economics, but my specialty, I was a livestock marketing specialist out here working with farmers and people in rural communities. I inadvertently helped start the hog industry in North Carolina. You saw all the dots down there. I went to North Carolina in 1970, and we were trying to find an alternative to tobacco. You know, it wasn't CAFOs back then. It was rated feed of pigs and things of that nature. And then I moved on to Oklahoma and worked with the big feedlots out in the Oklahoma Panhandle. So I spent a lot of my time, you know, the first half of my academic career, I was out here working with these big livestock operations. I was one of these bottom line economists. I said that farming as a way of life was out of date, and that farming had to become a bottom line business. That farmers, in order to stay competitive, had to get bigger, specialized, standardized, consolidated into larger operations. Part of the get big or get out. I call farms, farms were factories without roofs, and fields and feedlots were nothing but biological assembly lines. I know where the people that are coming from that are promoting industrial agriculture. I used to live there and work there. I used to believe those things. I'm not opposed to that. But I changed. I changed in the middle of like the 1930s, during what I call the farm financial crisis, and I won't go into great detail about how I came to the conclusion, but I began to see the negative impacts of this industrialization of agriculture. As the farms got bigger, they got fewer, which means you had to force more and more family farmers out of business in the process. And when the family farmers went out of business, the rural communities dried up. And then I discovered what we were doing with the land, with the pollution of chemicals and biological waste and erosion, a whole host of things. I had to change in the middle of my career. And for the past 25 years, I've been supporting something called sustainable agriculture. Ecologically sound, socially responsible, economically viable agriculture, not industrial agriculture. But animal agriculture, I believe, is still an essential part of sustainable agriculture. Every healthy natural ecosystem has something in it that performs the function of animals, and I think it's necessary. I'm not opposed to animal agriculture. And I tell people that tell me, you say you're destroying animal agriculture, I say, no, you're destroying animal agriculture. If you don't respond to consumers' concerns or the public concern about the way we produce animals in this country, people will quit eating animals, and we won't have a sustainable agriculture because we won't have an animal agriculture that our society will tolerate. I'm not opposed to animal agriculture, I'm just opposed to what we're doing. I got involved in the CAFO issues back in the mid-90s, inadvertently. I didn't really want to get involved in it. And I began to see that that was the epitome of what was wrong with agriculture. And since then, I've worked with people in 16 states across the country. I've worked in 4 provinces of Canada and recently in the country of Wales in the UK. And every one of these communities, like your community, is different, but there's some common issues that are under all of those. There's common issues that bring those concerns in every community that you go to. In this community, I think you have particular concerns. Some of your concerns are common, but some of them are unique. As I said, I've been here before. I'm not an expert here, but I've been here several times. I had an opportunity to speak at the Big Top Chicago, up in Pine Politics sometimes back. Stay at the Pinehurst Inn where we're staying in. I've been to public events in Ashland and in Wayland up here before. I understand something about your concern for the area in Kewaunee Bay, did I pronounce that right, and Apostle Islands and Lake Superior. This is a very special area. It's a very, very fragile place. And if I look around at all of the places where I've seen people who want to put CAFOs, I can't think of a worse place. There is no good place, but I can't think. And folks, it's not just one CAFO, and this is a big CAFO, but it's not just one. Because you see it over and over again. Once there's one here, then they've overcome the opposition, and then there will be another, and then there will be another. And once they've allowed 2 or 3, then how can you stop the others? And then there will be others. And that's the reason you see them clustered in places, because once they get a foothold in a place, then they continue to grow. I don't want to see you lose this battle. I don't want to see us lose the war here that we're fighting in the larger scale. And I think you need to be aware of the facts and fallacies, and you've seen some of those here today, but I'm going to hit a few high points, and the rest of them are in the paper, so you'll know that kind of the list as you go down. If you talk about water pollution, for example, then the PR campaign, they'll come in and say that farmers are great stewards of the land. They always care about the land. They care about the water, and they're stewards of nature. You know, there may be situations in which the farmers that run CAFOs really have an ethic of stewardship. And they feel like they're doing everything that they can within that system to take care of the land and to take care of the water and so on. But they're caught in a bad system. They're caught in a system that if they survive economically, then they're going to do things that no responsible steward of nature would do. And so they do what they feel like they have to do. The basic problem, as you heard about with manure here, what we're doing is we're concentrating too many animals, which means too much manure in too small a space. And that concentration of animals is essential for those CAFO operations to compete economically with the independent family farmers that they displaced. The facts of the matter are that in 1998, the EPA did a survey of the impact of CAFOs on water quality and on streams, and they concluded that there was 35,000 miles of streams in 22 states and groundwater in 17 states at that time that had been polluted by CAFOs specifically. And at that time, they were getting ready to sue the CAFO operators for violation of the Clean Water Act. And that's the reason they collected the information. But we had a change in administration, and they decided they were going to go to voluntary compliance rather than sue. And we haven't had a study since that specifically focused on CAFOs and the pollution capacity. CAFO operators, the fallacy they'll give you, well, we're doing a better job than the independent hog producers did before that. But you know what? We've had a threefold increase in the documented impaired waters, polluted waters in the state of Iowa since the early 2000s, a period of time when the CAFOs were replacing more and more independent family farmers. The evidence is there. The evidence is strong. What we're talking about here is what you've heard before. This operation was 6,000 animal units. That's the equivalent of 50,000 people. If you had 50,000 people that were going to put in a development down here where this is, would you say just go out and throw your waste, throw your sewage out in your backyard, you know, empty the pot in the backyard and let it flush off in the groundwater? No, you wouldn't do that. You get up to 1,000 animal units, we're talking about 8,000 or 9,000 people. You require a municipality to put in a sophisticated waste treatment facility to take care of that. But it's legal to go in and build a CAFO operation that does basically the same risk to public health. Another fallacy. They say that farmers, that the people in these CAFOs, they care about their animals. They take good care of, you know, they're in air-conditioned facilities and ventilated and all that kind of stuff. And they say, in addition to that, then farmers have an economic incentive, or the CAFO operators have an economic incentive to take care of the animals and keep them healthy so that they'll grow, be productive. But it's not true. It's a fallacy. Fact is, these animals basically are sick. They simply kill them, send them to slaughter before they can die of whatever illness or whatever mistreatment that they've received in the operation. You know what the lifespan of a chicken is? It can range from 7 to 20 years. You know how long they live? 6 weeks on a broiler, 18 months on a laying hen. They don't have to be healthy to live that long. What's the lifespan on a hog? 10 to 15 years. They go to market at 6 months. Breeding stock may last 4 or 5 years before they're culled because they're sick or they're not productive anymore. A dairy cow, 15 to 17 years. They make it about 4 or 5 years these days before they're ready for slaughter if they don't die while they're in the operations. It's profitable to have sick animals if you can kill them before they die. Sad. All the concern is in these operations is what's economically viable. There's no sense of that these are sentient beings, that they have an inherent right, or we have a responsibility to treat them with dignity and respect as other living things. There is simply too many of them in too small of spaces. I've talked to people that work there and they say you have to turn off your mind and think of them as nothing more than stove wood, or think of them as nothing more than some mechanistic thing that's going on out there. I had an opportunity to visit Poland a couple of years ago. And I had an opportunity to go out to a concentration camp outside the city of Lublin. It's called Majdanek concentration. They turned it into an extermination camp. And I saw the rows of barracks where the people were kept in a miserable condition for the short period of time before they went to the gas chamber. And I thought of those rows of chicken houses and hog houses like you've seen here. Folks, I don't care how caring you may be individually, there are no humane concentration camps. These animals are in environments such that you can't care about them humanely. It's not just emotion. There's 50 years of research now that we have on the treatment of animals in these confinement operations, and the research is all consistent. And some people are using that research to support changes in laws. Several states have outlawed gestation crates where the sows, the breeding sows, are kept in spaces so small they can't even turn around. And the chicken cages where they have the laying hens where they stand something the size of a sheet of paper, maybe less than that, for a chicken to live its whole life in. That's the reason they have the PR campaign that's focused on humane things, and they take you out and show these pristine kinds of facilities and everybody with the happy chickens and happy pigs to cover up what's actually going on in these situations. Issue of food safety. You heard some about this before, but the public relations says that we have the safest food supply in the world. Well, there probably been a time when that was true, but I think there's growing evidence that it's not true anymore. You check out the recall list. They go on I forget which one it is, CDC, which one is it has a recall list? You know where you can go on and see all the food recalls that are out there? What's that? FDA has the food recall list. You can go on and see the foods are recalled. A lot of those are the animal food recalls, and they're recalled for a whole range of things, and salmonella, listeria, campylobacter, E. coli, whole range. They haven't become routine yet, but they're certainly not uncommon in this country. And as was suggested before, I saw some studies where they were talking about contamination of meat, and I agree it may get more contamination in other places, but like 15–20% of the samples meat can be contaminated with one or more bacteria, and up to around 40% of that bacteria was antibiotic resistant. So I think you have reason to ask questions about what's going on in the food system today. And I talked about the mistreatment of animals. You know what? You heard this over and over again, but it used to be beef liver and pork liver were very common foods. You don't see much of those anymore. Why is that? Because the animals that come out of these concentrated animal feeding operations have been fed such high concentrate rations that their livers are diseased and abscessed to the point where there's very few, a small percentage of them that are even edible. Now, what do you think the meat is like from an animal that barely makes it to the slaughterhouse before it dies of liver failure? You know, these are things that we really need to be asking questions about. And there's also evidence that when you feed these higher level rations, and you end up with bacteria and other contaminations that are even more toxic to people, such as this E. coli 0157H7. It occurs because you're feeding these animals something they're not designed to eat, high energy grain rations rather than forages, and you create an environment in the rumen which causes those particular bacteria to grow faster than they would in a normal operation. There's also a growing amount of research that shows that animals that are raised free range, hunt grass, pasture-based, have more healthful food products in terms of the general makeup, in terms of the types of fats and things of that nature that's in them. So there's growing evidence that indicates that concerns about the safety of the food system, not just with respect to CAFOs, but the whole industrial agriculture with the pesticides and the GMOs and the whole range of things that go with that. Legitimate reasons to be concerned. Now, in response to all that, they said, well, even if you're concerned about all of these things, we just got to have this industrial agriculture in order to keep the price of food down and to feed the world. That's what they go do. But you know what the facts are, and I can tell you this as an agricultural economist, longtime livestock marketing specialist, there is absolutely no evidence that we're producing any more meat, milk, or eggs than we could have produced in independent family farming operation. We are simply doing it with fewer farmers because the operations are so much larger. And I can give you, we used to have things we call the cattle cycle, we call the hog cycle, and that meant that ever so often you give independent farmers a little bit of profit and they would produce far more than they could market at a profitable price, and the prices would drop again. And then when they dropped, they cut back, and then there was never a time when independent farmers couldn't supply more than you could put on more than they could sell at a profitable price when they were given a reasonable economic incentive to do so. And dairy is one of the primary situations, and I grew up on a dairy farm and studied this whole thing, is we consistently had surplus dairy products that we'd have to have government programs to get rid of. I can't remember what it was, but not too many years ago we had a government buyout program where the government was buying up cows and slaughtering because we had too much milk. And now they're telling us that we can't have enough milk unless we have CAFOs. There's nothing to support that. Basically what these CAFOs do is it allows each operator, investor, to have far more animals than they had before, and that's what's driving it. It's not the greater efficiency. And the consumers have not benefited. Any decrease in the cost of production at the farm level has been more than offset between the spread between farm level prices and retail prices, so that retail prices of meat, milk, and eggs have been going up faster than the overall inflation rate. And for the past 20 years, food has been one of the fastest rising segments of the whole consumer price index and the whole food inflation rate overall. This is all about profits for the corporations, profits for the investors. It's not about cheap food for people. And they say we can't feed the world, you know, without industrial agriculture. That's simply not true. They say we can't have, you know, like sustainable agriculture or organic. But again, there was a review in the Journal of Nature, one of the most respected reviews around it, had one of these meta-studies on organic, and they concluded a well-managed organic farming operation could produce essentially as much as you could on a conventional operation, and I would argue that was an underestimate because they were talking about research plots, and I know you go out with a real good organic farmer on that farm and they will outproduce a research plot over and over again. But the problem in this country is we don't have enough food. We have more than enough food. We have producing far more than enough food to feed everybody. 30% of all of the farm value in this country goes to exports, not to feed people in this country. We're burning up 40% of the corn crop for ethanol to put into our cars. We need more food. I mean, we're burning it up. There's hungry people in the world and we're burning it in our cars. You say, well, we're exporting it to other countries. You're exporting it, but it's not for food, it's for feed. We're not feeding the hungry Chinese or Indians. We're feeding a growing upper class in those countries that want meat rather than the grain, and they don't want to devote their grain crops to producing meat because it's made bad politically, so they grow the meat here and ship it over there. The rest of the country, the rest of the world, I learned working with the Food and Agriculture Organization, the UN, I wrote the North American Family Farm Report, but you know, the rest of the world don't want industrial agriculture, and they don't want our exports. More than 70% of the people in the world today are fed with fossil subsistence farms, and without changing their farming operations, going to sustainable agroecology, various other things where they have research in Africa, South America, and elsewhere, they could double or triple the yields on those farms if they just had a little help from caring people. You don't need to sacrifice Lake Superior, Chequamegon Bay, or anything else because you feel guilty about feeding the world. And there are other fallacies that I can go into. You know, when we say we're going to bring jobs into rural areas, that's basically what they always say. But I think you need to have in mind that what we're doing is actually forcing farmers out of business in the process of moving toward these large confinement operations. And the facts are out there today. There's a USDA report that went into this, and between 1980 and 2008, we lost 41% of our beef producers. We lost a lot of them before 1980 and there. We lost 90% of our hog producers. We lost 80% of our dairy producers. These were farmers that are forced out of business to make room for these CAFOs. That's not creating jobs, that's destroying jobs. The studies that have been done indicate that they employ far fewer farmers than the farmers that they displaced. And it's a different kind of work. Industrial operations gain their economic efficiency by simplifying, mechanizing, so that they hire fewer workers and can hire lower skilled workers, and the managers can manage more operations. I mean, it's all about reducing employment. It's all about reducing the quality of employment. That's what gives them their advantage. And so it's no surprise that when you see CAFOs move into local areas, they don't reduce local employment because local people won't work under the conditions for the pay that they have in these operations in general. I'll just quote you one study here that for Wisconsin, for example, between 98 and 2008, the years when we were going to CAFOs, the number of immigrant workers increased from 5% to 40%. You mean there's nobody in Wisconsin that knows how to milk cows, so we have to bring in people from other countries? I'm not opposed to immigration. I think it brings some healthy ethnic diversity to rural communities. But that's not the kind of employment that's going to increase your economic base, because people that move into communities, they have to have public services. Their kids have to go to school. They have to have health care, all of the other things that go with people coming in, and their wages are so low, they invariably put a bigger burden on the local tax base than any increase you have from the employment that comes into the communities. And that's not the only thing. The increased expending on roads and bridges and various other things with the heavy trucks more than offset. You know, I first got involved in this because they were promoting CAFOs in Missouri as a rural economic development strategy, and I looked at the facts and I said, it simply doesn't make sense. You know, another meta report, North Dakota Attorney General's Office, 2008, I think it was, it's referenced in my book. They went back and reviewed 50 years of socioeconomic research on industrial agriculture. The latter part of it focused on confinement animal feeding operations, and concluded that the communities have every reason to be concerned about the negative social and economic impacts on those particular communities. They just documented that consistently when you move from independent family farms to the large confinement kind of operation, the community suffers economically, socially, the overall quality of life. And when you get a community that becomes known as a CAFO community, then the only kind of employment you can attract is more employment that's about pollution, destruction, degradation, because they figure it's basically turned into a sacrifice zone. CAFOs are not a logical strategy for rural economic development. What I think is the Achilles heel of CAFOs is what Keeve talked about, antibiotic resistance. I think that's a big one. I'm not going to dwell on it other than the fact that, just to say that I can tell you with certainty that the livestock industry has known this was a problem since the early 80s, and maybe before that. I was at Oklahoma State University, and the dean of the College of Agriculture called everybody working with animal agriculture in for a meeting. And the dean, who was a fine man, he said, we've got a problem with the cattle feedlots and the CAFOs in general, because when we feed antibiotics to these animals, we're causing antibiotic resistant bacteria. We're breeding them. He says, we need to do something about that. That was in 1982, 1983. You said the mid-90s, they began to admit something was going on. They've known about it for a long time. They haven't done anything. There was a study of the General Accounting Office, U.S. General Accounting Office in 2004 that pointed out that they went back and reviewed a whole bunch of scientific studies, and they said, we found many studies that linked antibiotic resistance to feeding antibiotics to livestock. They said we found a few studies that questioned whether or not the transference between the CAFO units and the human population was there. The 2013 study that you talked about here, I think, resolved the doubt. That was the CDC study, and it basically says scientists around the world have concluded that there is strong evidence linking antibiotic resistance to CAFOs. Maybe it's not definite proof, but it's strong evidence. You have every reason to be concerned. I haven't even mentioned odors yet. That's the thing that people talk about first. The claim is, the fallacy is this is just, a normal kind of situation where it's routine odors and dust or whatever that comes with a livestock operation or farming operation, that there's no evidence linking it. But the fact is that CAFOs are fundamentally different. When you have anaerobic decomposition of the manure in these pits and various other places, it's a different kind of process than the normal process of when the manure is out on the land and deteriorates under a situation where it's in contact with the environment. And it creates a whole bunch of different emissions that can cause human health problems, like ammonia, nitrous oxide, hydrogen sulfate, and a number of other things. There's a number of studies, scientific studies, some of which I review in the paper, that are linking problems, particularly respiratory problems in children and old people living close to CAFOs. I'm hoping that some of this information is going to come out, because now there's a lawsuit by the Sierra Club, the Iowa Citizen for Community Action, and the Humane Society suing EPA for failure to enforce the Clean Air Act with respect to CAFOs. And I'm hoping that's going to bring some of that. In defense of this, the land-grant university people come in and say, well, there isn't conclusive evidence, you know. Their evidence is mounting. They say it's inconclusive with no proof. They can't go out and totally condemn it. I call that the tobacco defense. You know, they did that for years. They did it for decades. When I first went to North Carolina in 1970, we were talking about this, and they were saying, we don't have proof, inconclusive, whatever. You know, eventually the scientists were going to have to come around and recognize the fact that we're dealing with a mounting body of evidence that's destined eventually to bring about a consensus in public opinion for change. So that brings the question, and I'm kind of winding up here, but, you know, why don't we have regulations of CAFOs? With all this evidence, why don't we have regulations out here? It's because they're still considered to be agriculture. That's the reason you see the faces of farmers and ranchers. They're trying to tell you that it's no different than the independent family farmer that we've always had out here, that's always been held in such high esteem as caretakers of the community and caretakers of the earth. But these are not traditional family farmers. Even if they're operated by families, they don't have the traditional values of the family farm. On a traditional family farm, you know, the farm, the family, and the community were all inseparable. And if something wasn't good for the community, it wasn't good for the farm, and it wasn't good for the family. It was all part of the same whole. True family farmer wouldn't do something that destroyed the quality of life or the health or the property values of their neighbors. They wouldn't do something that destroyed the ability of the stream to support fish or other wildlife or things of this nature. True family farmers manage a farm like a natural ecosystem, where the output or the waste of one enterprise on this diverse operation become the input for the other, and it was all put together in such a way that it worked like a natural system that minimized the waste, and the waste that left was consistent with the ability of nature to assimilate that waste. They didn't put so many animals in one place that nature couldn't accommodate whatever they were doing here. And the reason we have minimal regulations on CAFOs is because they're considered to be consistent with traditional agriculture. And I would argue the regulations that we have today are adequate, maybe even more than are needed for traditional family farmers, or people that have traditional values of family farmers. You only need a few regulations for the outliers, the people that won't conform to the culture, or when somebody makes a mistake, you need to correct it. But these operations that we have today, these large confinement operations, they're factories. They're not farms. The people that are operating them may be doing the best they can possibly do with that system, but that's an industrial system. It's a linear system. It inherently creates waste, and it's a concentrated system that inherently creates more waste than nature can assimilate in a particular place. And that's the reason we regulate factories. That's the reason you control air emissions. That's the reason you control the water. And that's the reason in CAFOs eventually, if you're going to have a CAFO the size we're talking about here, you're going to have a sophisticated municipal waste treatment facility to go with that CAFO to protect the natural environment. The problem is in the system. So you look at it and you say, well, what are we going to do? The people that are obstructing the regulations, the people that are defending industrialization, these are people that have tremendous economic and political power, not just in Wisconsin, but all across the country. And they're not going to give up. They're going to use all of their political and economic influence to protect their right to pollute, is the way I would say. But you know what? We're more powerful. We're even more powerful because we, the people, still have the power in this democracy. And even if you think that we've lost our democracy, we, the people, have the power. And we have the right to take it back. And that's what we have to do. We have the the basic human rights of self-determination and self-defense. Whenever we have reasonable cause to think our health or our well-being or the well-being and health of our families are threatened, we have a fundamental right to protect ourselves. And we have a right to say we feel protected. We don't have to wait for some expert to tell us that the risk is great enough, that we're in danger and we will protect ourselves. This isn't ultimately a case of dueling scientists or dueling PR programs. This is ultimately an ethical and moral issue. Our Constitution says that when we find our Declaration of Independence said that when we find ourselves in a situation that is threatening to our safety and our happiness, that's what it says, then we have a right to rise up even if it's against the government regulations and against the government, and change the government if we have to. This is an ethical issue. I'm trying to be a little bit objective about ethics. I went back and read Adam Smith's book of Theory of Moral Sentiments. You know, Adam Smith wrote Wealth of Nations, but before he wrote that, he wrote a book called A Theory of Moral Sentiments, where he was trying to find an objective basis of determining whether something was moral or whether it wasn't moral, whether it was right or whether it's wrong. And he said the first thing you do is you put yourself in the person who is doing something, the actor. In this case, I would ask you, put yourself in the place of the person who wants to build the CAFO in your community. And ask if you were in that position, knowing what he has to know about the impact of this operation on this community, on this environment, on the water, knowing the resistance within this community, would you build it? Now, the second thing he says, put yourself in the place of the person who is affected by that act. You're there. You can think about that. You're in that place where you're having to think, what's going to be the impact on us, on this place that we love, on our physical well-being, but on the future generations that depend upon these resources.
Thank you.
And there's people in your community that have said, we don't really care about those things, apparently. That's not important to us. But do you have a responsibility to do nothing because they're not concerned? Or do you have a responsibility to stand up and do what you feel you need to do to protect yourself in your environment? The third thing he says, put yourself in the place of an impartial observer. I would say, go look at the science. Go look at the studies. Go look at communities that have been dealing with this issue for the past 50 years. You know, economists are always using these economic impact assessment models to say how many jobs we're going to. Go look at the communities and see what the economic status of those communities are. I think when you put yourself in the place of an impartial observer, my truth, there's no impartial support for these operations. The final thing that Adam Smith said, he says, if it looks immoral from all other perspectives, he says, ask yourself, is there some socially redeeming values that override that, such as the quote, unquote, just wars? Are the economic benefits, for example, that they proclaim great enough to override the ethical, moral concerns that you have? I would argue my truth again as an economist, there are none. We don't need CAFOs for domestic food security. Our industrial food system basically is killing us with a whole range of things, from obesity to heart disease to a whole range of other things. We don't need it for rural economic development. The rest of the world doesn't need our exports. They don't need our industrial agriculture. There is no socially redeeming concern, in my opinion, in my truth. But that's my truth. The important thing is that you people within this community, you need to come together and create a consensus as to what kind of community you want in the future. What do you want this community to be? You won't get everyone to agree, not on this issue. But you need to build a moral consensus. And just because something is legal doesn't mean that it's moral. It was once legal to have slaves in this country, but slavery has never been moral. It was once legal that women were the property, or wives were the property of their husbands, but it has never been morally right that women were property rather than people. It was once legal to smoke on airplanes in public places, but it was never right to willingly impose health risk onto someone else. I would argue that you in this community have a moral responsibility to protect your community, the environment, the lake, for the benefit of yourselves and the benefit of future generations, and that the rest of us have a moral responsibility to help you. Thank you very much.